Good morning, everyone. It is good to be here. You know, I was been thinking this morning about when I first began going to church services. I was about 18 years old, and I remember the preacher being up preaching and talking about all this stuff. I had no clue what he was talking about. Absolutely no clue. You know, night with ebb and pinion. What does that mean? You know, right? You know, what is that? You know, wings of darkness, a very poetic way of talking about or singing about the time that Jesus spent before he's crucified. He's in the garden, and it's a dark day, and it's a, you know, but, you know, I just remember the preacher, he's up, and he's putting all this stuff on the board, and I'm like, no clue, you know. But it's one of those things, like everything, you know, you stick with it for a while, it starts to make more sense. And so I want to welcome those that are visiting with us this morning, and I can sympathize, you know, if you hear things that are strange to your ears. But my prayer is that in the course of this lesson here, that not only here in the lesson, but things that have been said in our prayers and our songs, that they've been understandable to some degree. And this morning we're going to be talking about worship. We kind of 2 weeks ago began talking about this particular theme as the year is ending, and we're about to go into a new year, a new theme that will be developing over the year of sitting at the feet of Jesus, that will be getting going really in earnest as the new year opens. But I wanted to talk about this idea of true worship, because it's really important that we understand what the Bible teaches about worshiping God. It's really important, because as we're going to see, it isn't us who determines what worshiping God acceptably is. He's the one that tells us how to do this. And if we don't know what to do because we don't take the time or make the effort to understand what it is he has in mind, then that's going to cause some difficulty. And we'll talk about what that means here as we go along. But it's very important that we understand that in the previous lesson that we did on true worship, we had said that worship, or true worship, can be defined as honor, homage, reverence, adoration, praise, or respect given to God. And so the thing that we want to understand is that when we, and this is not complicated, it's just that maybe our thinking hasn't been directed in this way, and we have to take a fresh look at worship and what it really is. Remember in John chapter 4, when Jesus was at the well with the Samaritan lady and he said that those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth, right? Worship him. He instructs us how to do that. So worship then, and I want you to notice what it says up here, and I put these words in red for a reason. Giving. In one of the books of the prophets, in the book of Micah in chapter 6, talks about this. And he says, with what? Okay. With what shall I come to the Lord, Yahweh, God, and bow myself before the God on high? With what shall I come? What am I to bring? Okay. Shall I come with burnt offerings? with yearling calves, sacrifices? Does the Lord delight in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sins of my soul? Is that what God's asking? No. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord ask of you but to do justice, do what's right, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God? So with what shall we bow ourselves, worship before the God on high? Here's what I was taught way back. It says, you take the Lord's Supper. So we have the Lord's Supper, we have singing, praying, we listen to preaching, and we study. Now, I don't know if I've got the 5 acts of worship right there, but that isn't worship. And when you get ready to come to an assembly like this, and you think that doing these 5 things is worship, you need to start thinking differently, because they're not worship. He wasn't concerned with burnt sacrifices or 10,000 rams or 1,000 rivers of oil or your firstborn. He wasn't interested in that. Did he want them to sacrifice? Yeah, not their kids. Okay. Yeah, he wanted them to offer sacrifice, to sacrifice to him, absolutely. But was that the main thing? No. You know how many sacrifices God refused to accept? Read Hebrew. One of these Bible books. Just read chapter 1 of it. No. Read Isaiah 1. What are your multiplied sacrifices to me? Your hands are full of blood. You're adulterous. You're cheating one another. You're hating one another. You're murdering one another. I don't want your sacrifices. I want your heart. So worship is giving. When you get ready to come to this place for this purpose, you are coming here to give something, to offer something to God. Respect, honor, praise, reverence, adoration. That's what we're coming here to give Him. And these things we do, as I have pointed out to you in our previous lesson, are merely things that stimulate us to worship God. See? I want to talk for a moment about how dominant worship is in the Scripture. Over in the 20th chapter of Exodus, if you know your Old Testament a little bit, the 10 Commandments. And what was the first commandment that God gave to Israel? First one. You shall have no other gods before me. Period. Everything else flows from that. To whom are we going to offer praise and reverence and respect and honor and glory. God says, to me alone. And again, I remember a television personality that everyone knows saying on national television that she left the Christian faith because she heard about this God being a jealous God. And I didn't want to worship a God like that, and so she's off. Not without telling millions of people. What does that mean? Well, right here. If you have a wife or a husband, would you like them to have other men or women besides you? Well, would you? So why is it unusual that God would not want us to worship other gods? Yeah, he's jealous that way. He wants it to be him and no one else who receives our highest honor and respect and glory, etc. The most important thing to him was that he be number one. This writer says, and let's take a look at this and see if we agree. Sorry, Ron, we're going to pick you apart here. It is keeping him first, honoring him as God, having no other gods beside him. It is keeping him first. Our number one task as believers is to make sure that nothing, no God, person, object, task, duty, or pleasure comes before him in our priorities, in our plans, and in our affection, end quote. Putting him first, having no other gods besides him. And think about for a moment the tabernacle in the Old Testament. This was a place that God instructed Moses and the people to construct as a place of worship, where they would come to bow down before the God on high and offer their worship. Lots of things we could say about this tent in the wilderness. But God says to Moses as he completes this instruction, see that you make them after the pattern for them which was shown you on the mountain. So God says, I want you to build this thing, and I'm going to tell you how to construct it. I'm going to tell you all the dimensions, everything that goes inside of it, where it goes. Every single detail, God says, I'm going to give to you, and you see to it that you do it exactly as I tell you. And that makes sense because it is that God who would be worshiped in that place. So he told them exactly what to do. Later on, when Solomon built that wonderful temple, he says, all this, said David, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the details of this pattern. He's telling this to Solomon, who is going to build that temple. And just like that tabernacle had a specific pattern from God, so with the temple that would be built later, God gave specific instructions, detailed instructions as to how it was being constructed, be constructed for lots of reasons, but the underlying is that that's where they would come and offer to God. What does this say, and this is my point with all this, is what does it say about the priority of worship in the Scriptures, in the mind of God, that it took 7 chapters in Genesis covering 243 verses for God to discuss all the standards and measurements and furnishings that were to be a part of the tabernacle and later the temple as places of worship. You know how many verses it took to describe the whole creation of the universe? 31. Now, the number of verses isn't the point. The priority God gave it in the Bible is the point. There's a whole bunch of things he could have said about the creation that he didn't. Think if he would have went into detail about that. Well, but when it came to worship and what he wanted, that took up some space. And so Jesus, when he was tempted by the devil in the wilderness, says to Satan, "You shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only." You know, Jesus, we remember the things that Satan offered to Jesus. We won't go through them now for the sake of time. But he offered him several things by which he could show his power, make people so impressed. He offered him the kingdoms of the world, etc. But the thing is this, Jesus wanted those things. Now, you know why I say that? Because it's not temptation if you don't want it. You have to want it and have opportunity to get it or to do it. Those two together, that's temptation. So a part of Jesus wanted those things, but in giving this answer to Satan, "You shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only," Jesus swept into that command every being ever created. Every person is responsible to worship God. During this little window of life that we have, we are here with an opportunity to choose to worship God. You don't have to, but the opportunity is here. Alistair Begg said, "Anything or any person, including ourselves, that denies our primary loyalty has become another God," or that claims our primary loyalty becomes another God. Right? So, acceptable worship is worship as God describes and instructs us. So we are the temple of God. God's people today are his temple. That means he dwells here. That means that he is the one who is in control. And we worship him. How do we worship God acceptably? You come here, we're talking about this worship. You come here to give God your honor and your praise, and everything that we do is a reflection that if God says to take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, we honor him and we do that. If he wants us to sing, making melody in our heart, then we do that because that's what he wants us to do. We honor him by doing that. These things stimulate us to worship, stimulate us to give him honor, stimulate us to give him recognition. They are not in and of themselves worship. And if you come here to do these things and leave here thinking that you've worshiped God through those things alone, you haven't worshiped Him. And it's not complicated. I'm going to go to the service and I'm going to give God my respect and my adoration, and everything I do in that service is a reflection of how much I adore Him, how much I respect Him, how much I appreciate Him and give Him glory. And then you've worshiped. Not complicated. What about unacceptable worship? What about unacceptable worship? We're going to look at three kinds very briefly. Okay? And for the first one, we're going to talk about worshiping God through idols. And just a couple of verses back here in the book of Exodus, and we go back to the Old Testament and look at examples of things that people did that give us understanding today. So the Apostle Paul says the things that were written before time were written for our learning. Okay? In 1 Corinthians 10, these things were written as examples for us, so that we may not crave evil things as they also craved. And so, God is bringing His people. He brought them out of Egyptian captivity, and they're traveling in the wilderness. Moses has gone up on the mountain to get the law, and he's gone for a while. Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we did not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Tear off the gold rings which are in your ears, and in your wives and your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." And they all put those things, and they made them a golden calf. "Behold your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." This God is going to represent the true God. Moses is gone. We don't know what happened to him. Let's make a God. And He's going to take us the rest of the way. Okay. This is why it's so dangerous to have physical things that we see and do and call our recognition of those things worship. Okay. God can't be worshiped that way. Worship the real thing, right? Lots and lots of examples we can give of this. Another thing that we can do that falls into the category of unacceptable worship is worshiping the true God in an unauthorized manner. So we have certain examples of that in the Bible. Nadab and Abihu, these sons of Aaron, decided that they're going to offer worship to God. So it's like they go to service, right? And God has said they are to burn incense, and when they do so, they are to take it from a fire that's perpetually burning, and they were to take the fire from that fire and use it in that worship. Well, these two young men decided that we'll just make our own fire. What's the big deal? It doesn't matter, right? So they did that. And the record tells us that fire came down from heaven and consumed them. It says here that Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which He had not commanded them. And fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, listen to this. It is what the Lord said. By those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. and before all the people, I will be honored. I will. This is what we bring. Now, if I'm going to introduce things into this service that God has not commanded, you think he's going to treat me any differently? If I influence you to worship God in a way he hasn't commanded, is it going to turn out differently? No, he's the creator. We're the created. He loves us. He gave a son for us because he loves us that much, because of his great love for us, Paul said. And he tells us as a father, just like you will or do with your own children, this is what's expected because it's for our good. And you have the authority in your home over your children, and God has authority over his children. And if I don't worship him in a way that he's authorized, and I offer him worship, strange fire, if you will, I'm not honoring him, and I'm not respecting him. That's what I'm supposed to bring here, honor and respect. If Nadab and Abihu had honored and respected God, they wouldn't have done what they did. They would have went to the fire that God said, took their fire, offered their incense, and God would have been pleased. In 1 Samuel 13, this is where Saul, the king, decided that he would offer the sacrifice instead of waiting for the Levitical priest who was in charge of such things to do that. It says, talking of Saul, now he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. Sounds like in Exodus 32, right? Well, Moses is gone. We don't know what happened to him, right? So Saul said, bring to me the burnt offering and peace offerings, and he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and to greet him, but Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul said, because I saw the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked a favor of the Lord, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. But he had no right to do that. No matter what the circumstances were, he didn't have the right. He did not have the God-given right, but he did it anyway. And Samuel let him know real clearly, God has taken this kingdom away from you. And he's going to give it to someone better than you. Someone that will do, a man after his own heart. How did God define it? Who will do all his will. Uzzah, 2 Chronicles 26, Uzziah, same thing, king, took it upon himself to offer sacrifice. When he refused to leave, bam, the leprosy right on his forehead. And that man died a leper. Last thing that's said about, and boy, when you read about this man, he had everything. I mean, he had it all. God blessed that man. It's just astounding the way he was blessed by God. But it got to his head. And he thought he was more than he was, and that he could actually go into the temple of God and offer sacrifice. You see, Jesus said in John 15 about people that do this, he told his audience, and he's telling us, in vain do they worship me, says God, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men, the commandments of men. When we mix those things in with God's word, it's empty, it's useless, it's vain. Total waste of time. unacceptable worship. And then last but not least, worshiping God with the wrong attitude. Okay. You know, very few, if any of us, would ever want to worship the true God through an idol, or consciously invent our own ways to worship God. You know, we try to worship God according to the Scripture, according to what He has revealed to us. But a question that each one of us must ask ourselves is, do I have the right attitude in worship? You see, because He said those who worship the God, the true worshipers, will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. In Malachi, you know, the priests are described there, this is the last book of the Old Testament, and the priests there are described as looking at the things that they were told to do and the worship they were told, and they had these certain duties and sacrifices, these things, and they said, oh my, how tiresome it is. It's just tiresome, just doing the same old thing, you know, just how tiresome it is. You ever feel like that? Sometimes, you know, a Christian, you know, will say, I overslept. I know people oversleep. You know, I'm not attacking you if you oversleep. I'm just saying. You know, that's not a good thing to oversleep and not come and offer God your worship. These guys were tired. I don't know how tiresome it is. And you know, the bottom line is that these individuals are examples of people who are walking by their emotions. I'm tired. I don't feel like that. Right? And when you walk by your emotions, when your emotions govern what you do, you're erratic. Emotions go all over the place. And the bottom line is this: if I'm going to serve God, it doesn't matter if I'm tired. It doesn't matter if I'm feeling low. It doesn't matter that this thing happened or that thing happened if I'm not walking by my emotions, but I'm walking by the Spirit. Outward circumstances are not going to change that. Feelings do not determine what we do for God. Well, these guys, well, hey, you know, so tired, well, at least we can get rid of these junk animals and we give God our sick and lame, you know. Okay. But have the right attitude. Okay. They were just going through the motions, and their hearts were far from God. It was just a ritual routine for them. They weren't going to sacrifice the best. They weren't giving the Lord their hearts. Their heart wasn't in it. When you come to worship, your heart needs to be in it. Well, what does that mean? That means you're paying attention. That means you know why you're here. You bring the best you have to offer. I used to wake people up, you know, when I was younger. Not older people. Younger people, I'd wake them up. Hey, what's up? I don't do that anymore, by the way. But that just felt like I'm preaching and people are sleeping. What's up with that? I mean, it kind of takes the wind out of your sails a little bit. I don't think this is getting through. You know? What am I doing up here? You know, you bring your best. Get some rest on Saturday night. Be awake. You know, get out of bed in the mornings. Okay, I'm going to go worship God. I'm going to give Him my heart. I'm going to give Him my adoration and praise and all the things we've been talking about. and bring your heart filled with gratitude. Right? Let us show gratitude, the Hebrew writer said that, so that we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe. Okay? And so, as we conclude this lesson this morning, 2 times in Revelation, the book of Revelation, chapter 10, and in chapter 22, John fell down at the feet of an angel to worship him. And the angel said, don't do that. You don't worship me. I'm a fellow servant of yours and of God. And he said, worship God. Don't worship me. And that's the theme of eternity, the theme of redemptive history, to worship the true, living, and glorious God. Give him our heart, give him our adoration, give him our thanks. Bring that to him, and that's acceptable in his sight. If you're not a person that has begun that journey in your life, please take advantage of us. We're here, willing to open up the Bible and let you see what God says and where you fit into that. And get on that road to growth and deepening understanding of him and his will. And he has prepared for those that love him things that we can't even imagine. But he talks about them in his word. We're here looking beyond this life to the things that are not seen. For the things that are seen are temporal. All this, blink of an eye, it'll be gone. But the things that are not seen are eternal. Okay? Please don't let this opportunity get by you to at least be willing to see what God has to say. As together we stand and sing our song of invitation.